Storm of conflict churned the sands of a continent into a swirling fury.
The Desert Fox didn't just tell a war story, it humanized the enemy. In 1951, just 6 years after World War II ended, Hollywood did the unthinkable. They made a film about a Nazi general and turned him into a hero. Veterans protested, critics were divided, and one man's performance changed how the world saw the other side forever. These are 20 weird facts about the Desert Fox. And the bonus? The lead actor refused to meet the man who actually knew Rommel because he was terrified of what he might learn. Buckle up. This story cuts deeper than desert sand. Before James Mason became Rommel, the role almost went to someone who'd actually fought against him. Laurence Olivier was the studio's first choice. Fresh off his Shakespearean triumphs and Hollywood's success with Wuthering Heights, Olivier seemed perfect. He had the gravitas, the intensity, the command. But there was one massive problem. Olivier had served in the British Royal Navy during World War II. He'd been part of the very forces fighting Rommel's Africa Corps in North Africa. When the script arrived, Olivier read it in silence, then put it down. He couldn't do it. It wasn't about the quality of the writing or the size of the paycheck. It was personal, too personal. He'd lost friends to German forces. He'd seen the destruction firsthand, and no matter how complex or sympathetic the portrayal, he couldn't bring himself to embody a Nazi officer. The studio scrambled. They needed someone with similar stature, but without that direct connection to the war. That's when James Mason's name came up. British, sophisticated, compelling, but crucially, he'd spent the war years making films, not fighting battles. Mason said yes, and in doing so, he stepped into one of the most controversial roles of his career. The film's German military advisor hated everything about it until he saw the final cut. General Fritz Bayerland had been Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa. He'd fought beside him, planned strategies with him, watched him outmaneuver Allied forces across the desert. So, when 20th Century Fox approached him to ensure historical accuracy, he agreed with extreme reluctance. He arrived on set expecting a propaganda piece, a whitewashing of history, another Hollywood fantasy. But something shifted during production. He watched James Mason study Rommel's mannerisms from old newsreels. He saw the script tackle Rommel's growing disillusionment with Hitler. He noticed the film didn't shy away from difficult questions about loyalty, duty, and complicity. Bayerland started giving detailed notes, not just on military tactics, but on Rommel's personality, how he spoke to his men, how he moved under pressure, the subtle ways he expressed doubt. By the time filming wrapped, Bayerland had completely changed his stance. He called it the most honest portrayal of Rommel he'd ever seen. And coming from a man who'd served directly under the Desert Fox himself, that meant everything. The film gained credibility it could never have manufactured, because sometimes the harshest critics become the strongest advocates. James Mason prepared for the role by doing something most actors would never attempt. He refused to meet anyone who'd actually known Rommel personally. The studio had lined up interviews with former officers, war correspondents, even members of Rommel's family. Mason turned them all down. His reasoning was radical. He believed that meeting real people who loved or admired Rommel would cloud his judgment. He'd start performing for them instead of finding the truth of the character. He wanted to build Rommel from the inside out, using the script, historical records, and his own instincts rather than trying to satisfy the memories of those left behind. It was a dangerous gamble. It meant working without a safety net, without the validation of people who could say, yes, that's exactly how he was. But Mason trusted the process. He studied photographs for hours, analyzed Rommel's body language in newsreels, read his writings and letters. He created a portrait based on evidence rather than sentiment. And when the film premiered, even those who'd known Rommel admitted Mason had captured something essential. Not the surface details, but the inner conflict, the man behind the legend. And he'd done it entirely on his own terms. The desert scenes weren't filmed in North Africa. They weren't even filmed in a desert. 20th Century Fox wanted authenticity, but logistics and budget made filming in Libya or Egypt impossible. So they did what studios had done for decades. They faked it. The Sahara Desert in the Desert Fox was actually the Borrego Desert in Southern California, about 90 miles from Los Angeles. But here's where it gets interesting. The production didn't just show up and start shooting. They sent a team of military historians and geologists to North Africa first. These experts took thousands of photographs, collected soil samples, documented the exact color and texture of the sand, studied how light hit the dunes at different times of day. Then they tried to recreate those conditions in California. They brought in special sand to match the North African color. They scheduled shoots to catch the same quality of light. They even imported specific desert plants to dress the background. The effort paid off. When the film premiered, veterans who'd actually fought in North Africa said the locations looked completely authentic. Some didn't believe it wasn't real until they were told. It proved that sometimes the best illusion comes from obsessive attention to detail. The Desert Fox wasn't shot in the Sahara, but for 2 hours on screen, it might as well have been.
The saga of cunning and courage across the trackless waste.
The film almost destroyed James Mason's career before it even premiered. In 1951, America was deep in the Red Scare. Senator Joseph McCarthy was hunting communists everywhere, and Hollywood was terrified. So, when word leaked that Mason was playing a Nazi general, not as a villain, but as a complex, sympathetic human being, the backlash was immediate and vicious. Veteran groups called for boycotts. Newspaper editorials accused Mason of betraying Allied soldiers. His mail turned ugly, filled with threats and accusations. Some theaters refused to book the film. The studio panicked and considered shelving the entire project. Mason stood firm. He gave interviews defending the film's artistic integrity, explaining that understanding your enemy doesn't mean forgiving them. He argued that Rommel's story, particularly his eventual opposition to Hitler, was important to tell. The controversy raged for months. Then something unexpected happened. When the film finally opened, audiences saw what Mason had been trying to explain. This wasn't a glorification of Nazis. It was a nuanced exploration of a man caught between duty and conscience. Critics who'd been skeptical praised the film's courage. And slowly, the protests died down. Mason's gamble paid off. But for a while there, it looked like playing Rommel might end his Hollywood career before the opening credits even rolled. Director Henry Hathaway shot the entire film in just 28 days. That's barely 4 weeks to capture one of the most complex war stories ever attempted. Most war films took months. Hathaway did it in less than a month. And it wasn't because he was cutting corners. Hathaway was a perfectionist, known for demanding take after take until he got exactly what he wanted. But he had a philosophy. He believed that speed kept performances fresh and instinctive. Too much time meant actors started overthinking. Directors started second-guessing, and the raw truth got lost in the process. So he pre-planned everything with military precision. Every shot was storyboarded. Every camera angle was mapped out in advance. Every actor knew their marks before cameras rolled. When they arrived on set each day, there was no debate, no discussion, just execution. James Mason later said it was the most intense shooting experience of his career. Some days they'd film 15 to 20 pages of script. Other productions might do 3 or 4. The pace was relentless, exhausting, unforgiving, but it worked. The performances feel immediate, urgent, alive. There's no time for artifice when you're moving that fast. And Hathaway proved that sometimes the best way to capture truth is to not give anyone time to construct a lie. The Desert Fox wasn't carefully crafted over months. It was seized in 4 frantic weeks. The real Rommel's son visited the set unannounced, and what he did shocked everyone. Manfred Rommel was a teenager when his father died. By 1951, he was a young man trying to understand the complex legacy he'd inherited. He'd heard Hollywood was making a film about his father, and decided to see for himself. He didn't contact the studio. He didn't ask for special treatment. He just showed up one day during filming, stood quietly at the edge of the set, and watched. Nobody recognized him at first. He was just another observer in the small crowd of visitors and crew members. Then someone noticed him staring intensely at James Mason between takes, not with anger or disapproval, but with something else. Recognition, maybe, or grief. When word spread about who he was, the set went silent. Everyone expected him to introduce himself, to offer notes, to correct something. Instead, Manfred Rommel did something completely unexpected. He turned around and left. He walked off the set without saying a word to anyone. Later, he sent a brief letter to the studio, In it, he said watching Mason had been too painful. The mannerisms, the voice, the way he held himself. It was too close to the father Manfred had lost. He couldn't stay. But he wanted them to know the film mattered, that getting it right mattered. And then he never contacted them again. One scene in the film was shot with real German military equipment that had been captured during the war. The US Army still had warehouses full of seized German tanks, vehicles, and weapons from World War II. The studio asked to borrow some for authenticity, and the Army agreed, with one condition. Every piece of equipment had to be rendered permanently inoperable before it left military custody. They couldn't risk functional German military hardware ending up in civilian hands, even for a film. So, weapons were welded shut, tank engines were removed, vehicles were gutted. What arrived on set looked perfect but was completely hollow, which created a problem. The scene where Rommel inspects his tank divisions required vehicles that could actually move. The solution was absurdly complicated. They fitted the German tank shells over American tank chassis. From the outside, they looked like authentic German Panzers. Inside, they were running on US military engines. It was a bizarre hybrid, German skin over American bones. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here they were, telling the story of a German general using equipment that was simultaneously captured enemy hardware and disguised Allied machinery. The symbolism was almost too perfect. In a film about the blurred lines between enemy and human, even the props became a metaphor. And when those fake German tanks rolled across the California desert, they represented something larger than historical accuracy. They were ghosts of a war that was over, but never really ended.
Storm of conflict churned the sands of a continent into a...
The film's portrayal of Hitler caused more problems than Rommel's characterization. James Mason's Rommel was controversial, but defendable. The script showed him as conflicted, eventually turning against the Nazi regime. But Hitler had to appear in the film too, and there was no way to make that sympathetic. The actor playing Hitler, Luther Adler, faced an impossible task. Make him too human, and you risk humanizing a monster. Make him too cartoonish, and you undermine the entire film's credibility. Adler studied for weeks. He watched every piece of footage available of Hitler, not the speeches, but the private moments, the unguarded gestures, the way he moved when he thought cameras weren't watching. What Adler discovered disturbed him. Hitler in private moments wasn't a raging lunatic. He was calculated, controlled, almost ordinary until he decided to perform. That split personality became Adler's approach. In the scenes where Rommel meets with Hitler, Adler plays him as a politician, charming one moment, threatening the next. Always watching, always calculating. It's one of the most unsettling Hitler portrayals ever captured because it refuses to make him a monster. Instead, it shows him as something worse, a deeply intelligent, manipulative human being who chose evil. The performance was so disturbing that some theaters cut the Hitler scenes entirely. They couldn't handle seeing him portrayed as anything other than a ranting villain. But Adler had captured something true and terrible. No one expected The Desert Fox to make money. The studio saw it as a prestige project, something that might earn critical respect, but would lose money at the box office. They were wrong. Spectacularly wrong. The film opened in limited release to test the waters. Would American audiences really pay to see a sympathetic portrayal of a Nazi general just 6 years after the war ended? The answer shocked everyone. The Desert Fox became one of the highest-grossing films of 1951. It played in theaters for months, not weeks. It expanded from limited release to wide distribution. Word of mouth drove ticket sales higher and higher. But here's the strangest part. The film did massive business in Germany. It became one of the biggest box office hits in post-war German cinema. For a country still processing its guilt and trauma from the war, The Desert Fox offered something unexpected. A German character who was brave, intelligent, and ultimately recognized the evil of the regime he served. Rommel became a way for Germans to reclaim some sense of honor from the wreckage of the Nazi years. Whether that was healthy or dangerous remained hotly debated for decades. But commercially, it was undeniable. The film nobody thought would make money became a genuine international hit. And in doing so, it proved that sometimes the riskiest stories are the ones audiences need most, even when nobody realizes it yet. The scene where Rommel's staff debates whether to obey Hitler's orders wasn't scripted. It was improvised during a lunch break. The actors playing German officers were eating together when someone made a joke about following impossible commands. The conversation turned serious. These were British and American actors playing German soldiers, and suddenly they were grappling with real questions about duty and morality. Director Henry Hathaway overheard them and grabbed a cameraman. He told them to keep talking, but in character, and he'd shoot it. No script, no preparation, just raw debate about loyalty versus conscience. The actors didn't know they were being filmed at first. They were just exploring ideas, pushing each other's arguments, getting heated. When Hathaway called cut 20 minutes later, he had some of the most powerful dialogue in the entire film. The studio wanted to reshoot it with proper lighting and sound. Hathaway refused. He said the roughness made it real. You can see it in the final film. The scene has a different energy than everything around it. The actors aren't performing, they're arguing. And that authenticity, captured by accident during a lunch break, became one of the most quoted sequences in the movie. Because sometimes the best moments happen when nobody's trying to make a moment at all.
Here, one man whose audacity...
James Mason never watched the finished film with an audience. He attended the premiere, walked the red carpet, smiled for photographs, and then left before the screening started. His wife asked him why. He said he couldn't bear to watch people's reactions. The role had consumed him for months. He'd studied Rommel obsessively, defended the project publicly, risked his career on this one performance. And now he was terrified. What if audiences saw it as Nazi propaganda? What if they thought he'd betrayed Allied veterans? What if his entire interpretation was wrong? So he walked out of his own premiere and spent the evening sitting alone in a park. He didn't read reviews for weeks. He avoided talking about the film in interviews. It wasn't until months later, when the box office numbers came in and the critical consensus was clear, that he finally watched it. He rented a theater for a private screening, just him and his wife. When the lights came up, she asked him what he thought. Mason was silent for a long moment. Then he said it was exactly what he'd hoped it would be, but he never wanted to watch it again. The performance had taken something from him. Playing a man torn between duty and conscience had forced Mason to examine his own choices during the war, and what he'd found in that mirror was complicated and painful. The Desert Fox made him a star, but it also left scars. The British government tried to ban the film before it was even finished. When word reached London that Hollywood was making a sympathetic film about Rommel, Parliament erupted. Members stood up demanding the government intervene. How could Americans make a hero out of a Nazi general while British war widows were still grieving? The British Board of Film Censors was pressured to reject the film sight unseen. But they had a problem. They couldn't legally ban a film they hadn't watched, so they waited. When the finished film finally arrived for certification, something unexpected happened. The censors watched it in silence, prepared to hate it, but they couldn't find grounds to ban it. The film didn't glorify Nazis. It didn't minimize Allied suffering. It told a complicated story about a complicated man. After heated internal debate, they approved it with an A certificate, suitable for adults. The decision caused an uproar. Protests were organized outside theaters. But the censors stood firm. And here's the twist. Within weeks of release, British audiences were packing theaters, including veterans, including people who'd lost family members fighting in Rommel's forces. Because the film wasn't asking them to forgive their enemy. It was asking them to understand that war creates impossible choices for everyone, and sometimes understanding is more powerful than hatred. One scene was filmed in complete silence, and it changed how war films were made forever. The moment where Rommel realizes Hitler has ordered him to commit suicide, there's no music, no sound effects, just James Mason's face. Hathaway made that choice against the studio's wishes. They wanted dramatic scoring, maybe some ominous German military music, something to tell the audience how to feel. Hathaway said no. He wanted nothing, complete silence except for breathing. The studio fought him. They said audiences would think the sound had broken. Hathaway insisted. When they tested the scene, something remarkable happened. In a theater full of people, you could hear them holding their breath. The silence on screen created silence in the audience. Mason's performance needed no enhancement. You could see the calculations behind his eyes, the grief, the acceptance, the final understanding that there was no way out. It lasted barely a minute, but it felt eternal. And after The Desert Fox, other filmmakers started using silence differently, not as empty space, but as its own kind of emphasis. War films began to trust quiet moments. They learned that sometimes the most powerful sound is no sound at all because Hathaway refused to let music fill a moment that needed to breathe. That silence became more memorable than any score could have been. The actor playing Rommel's wife wasn't told how the film ended until they shot her final scene. Jessica Tandy was cast as Lucy Rommel, but director Hathaway did something unusual. He gave her script pages out of order, never revealing the complete arc. She knew it was a war film about her husband's military career, but she didn't know about his forced suicide, about the conspiracy against Hitler, about any of it. Hathaway wanted her performance to feel unguarded, authentic, free from the weight of knowing what was coming. So, Tandy played each scene as it came, building a portrait of a devoted wife without knowing it was leading to tragedy. Then came her final day of shooting. That's when Hathaway finally gave her the last pages, the scene where she learns her husband is dead. Tandy read it for the first time and broke down. The crew thought she was rehearsing. She wasn't. She was processing grief in real time. Hathaway called for cameras and they captured it. One take, raw, unfiltered. Tandy later said she felt manipulated and angry. She refused to speak to Hathaway for weeks, but when she saw the final film, she understood. Her performance had an honesty that couldn't have been manufactured because she'd lived through the revelation with the character, and that pain was real, even if the story wasn't hers.
Very strong, darling. I want you to be very strong, very brave.
The film's most famous line wasn't in the original script. In the absence of orders, find something and kill it. That became one of the most quoted lines in military cinema. Soldiers loved it. War films referenced it for decades, but it was never written. James Mason improvised it during a scene where Rommel addresses his officers before a battle. The scripted dialogue was longer, more detailed, more traditionally inspirational. Mason felt it was too much. He asked Hathaway if he could try something shorter, sharper. Hathaway agreed to one take. Mason delivered the line with cold precision, then moved on. The officers in the scene reacted with genuine surprise because they'd been expecting the scripted version. Their faces showed real uncertainty. When Hathaway watched playback, he knew immediately it was staying. The studio's script supervisor flagged it as an error. Hathaway told them to leave it alone. The line made it into the final cut and became instantly iconic. Military academies quoted it. Real soldiers adopted it as an unofficial motto. It appeared in history, books discussing Rommel's tactical philosophy. And it all came from one improvised moment, when an actor decided less was more. Sometimes the perfect line isn't the one that was carefully crafted. It's the one that appears in the moment, like it was always meant to be there. The film's battle sequences used actual World War II combat footage, and nobody told audiences. This was common practice in the 1950s war films, but The Desert Fox took it further than most. Henry Hathaway obtained classified military footage from the North Africa campaign, actual combat filmed by both Allied and German forces. He cut it seamlessly into the stage battle scenes. Explosions that looked too real, they were real. Tanks firing in the distance, real. Soldiers running through smoke and chaos. Some of them were Hollywood extras, others were real soldiers in real battles. The blend was so effective that even military historians couldn't always tell what was authentic and what was recreated. But here's where it gets ethically complicated. Some of that footage showed men dying, real deaths captured on film, edited into a Hollywood production. The studio never acknowledged this. They marketed everything as staged action. When the truth eventually came out decades later, it sparked fierce debate. Was it disrespectful to use real combat footage as entertainment? Or was it honoring those moments by not trying to fake them? The answer probably depends on who you ask. But there's no denying that those authentic moments gave The Desert Fox a visceral power that pure Hollywood staging couldn't match. The film felt real because parts of it were terrifyingly real. James Mason kept one prop from the set and it changed his life. Rommel's Field Marshal's baton, the symbol of his rank and authority. On the last day of filming, Mason asked if he could keep it. The studio said yes. He took it home, put it on his desk, and every day for the rest of his career, he looked at it before going to work. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Mason later explained that playing Rommel taught him something about acting he had never understood before. The best performances aren't about becoming someone else. They're about finding the part of yourself that could have been that person under different circumstances. Every human being contains multitudes, capacity for good and evil, courage and cowardice, loyalty and betrayal. The baton represented that understanding. It reminded him that he had found Rommel not by pretending to be a German general, but by exploring the parts of himself that could understand Rommel's choices. When Mason died in 1984, the baton was still on his desk. His family donated it to a film museum where it remains today. Visitors walk past it without knowing its significance. But for Mason, it was more than a prop. It was evidence that he'd touched something true in a role everyone told him would destroy his career. And in the end, it defined him instead. The film premiered in Germany before it premiered in America, and the reaction was terrifying. 20th Century Fox was nervous about American audiences, but they were absolutely terrified of how Germans would respond. So they did something unprecedented. They screened it first in Munich, in a theater packed with German veterans, many of whom had served under Rommel himself. The studio executives sat in the back, ready to flee if the crowd turned violent. For 2 hours, the theater was silent. No laughter, no gasps, nothing. Just heavy, uncomfortable quiet. When the lights came up, nobody moved. The studio representatives were sweating, certain they had made a catastrophic mistake. Then something happened. An old man in the front row stood up. He'd been a lieutenant in the Africa Corps. He turned to face the crowd and began speaking. He said the film had gotten it right. Not everything, but the important things. Rommel's conflict, his honor, his ultimate recognition that Hitler was leading Germany to ruin. The man spoke for 5 minutes, and when he finished, the crowd began to applaud. Not for the film exactly, but for the acknowledgement that their experience was more complicated than history had allowed. That premiere changed everything. If German veterans accepted the film, American audiences would probably follow. And they did, because sometimes the hardest audience to face is the one that actually lived through the story you're telling. The Desert Fox changed war films forever, but not in the way anyone expected. Before 1951, war movies were simple. Clear heroes, clear villains, good versus evil. The Desert Fox asked a dangerous question. What if the enemy is also human? What if they have families, doubts, moral struggles? What if they're capable of both terrible acts and genuine courage? The film didn't answer these questions cleanly. It left audiences uncomfortable, unsettled, and that discomfort spread. Over the next decade, war films started changing. They became more complex, more ambiguous, more willing to explore the gray areas. Films like Bridge on the River Kwai, Paths of Glory, even later works like Apocalypse Now, they all owe something to the Desert Fox. Because once you've shown that the enemy can be portrayed with humanity and complexity, you can't go back to simple propaganda. The film opened a door that couldn't be closed. It proved audiences could handle complicated truth better than comfortable lies. And for that, it remains one of the most influential war films ever made, even though most people today have never heard of it. Sometimes the most important films aren't the most famous ones. They're the ones that change what films were allowed to be. After the film's success, James Mason received a letter that he never opened. It arrived with a German postmark, no return address, written in careful English. The envelope sat on his desk for weeks. His wife asked him why he wouldn't read it. Mason said he was afraid it was from Rommel's family, thanking him or condemning him. Afraid it was from a Nazi sympathizer, claiming he'd gotten it wrong. Afraid it was from a Holocaust survivor, calling him a traitor. He couldn't bear any of those possibilities, so the letter remained sealed. When Mason died, his family found it in his personal effects. They debated opening it for years before finally deciding to respect his choice. The letter was donated, still sealed to a film archive. It remains unopened to this day. No one knows what it says. Maybe it's praise, maybe it's condemnation, maybe it's something else entirely. But that sealed envelope has become its own kind of symbol. A reminder that some questions don't have answers, some doors stay closed, and sometimes the most honest response to complexity is simply to acknowledge that we don't know. The Desert Fox asks difficult questions. And maybe the most fitting ending is that some of those questions remain unanswered, preserved in an envelope that will never be opened.